Greetings YouTube, Remarkable Republican here to bring you the truth with truth-flavored bias, and today I am going to unveil the true identity of the Zodiac Killer. Now, people have been trying to break this case for about 50 years now, but up to this point no one has succeeded. However, I've dedicated myself to the task of learning everything there is to know about the case over the last few months, and I have figured it all out. So in this video, I'm going to lay out who the real Zodiac Killer is, and I will give you unimpeachable evidence of the facts. So buckle up and get ready to learn the truth about the Zodiac case. The secret to solving any cold case is to review the evidence very thoroughly and try to establish what happened. This is something that a lot of cops don't really do very well, and also something that most amateur sleuths don't know how to do. But as someone who is excellent at research, I was able to go through all of the data for the last few months, and I have arrived at a correct conclusion. But first, I will just show you what the investigation looked like up to the present. So, the murders were spread between Vallejo and San Francisco, and the two police departments in each city did not cooperate. Vallejo was very suspicious of San Francisco's competence, and they didn't trust that San Francisco would be up to date on forensics and things like that. At the time, San Francisco was more worried about hippies, drugs, and rampant homosexuality than they were about murderers going on killing sprees. Both police departments interviewed many suspects for their respective murders, but of course they didn't cooperate or corroborate, and they also had very little follow-up of these suspects. They would let these guys go after very flimsy alibis were provided. Back then, you could kind of just make stuff up. There was no internet or social media, so it was very much easier to make up an alibi that seemed foolproof. Dirty Harry was actually the biggest effort ever to catch the Zodiac Killer. A lot of people don't realize that, but MK Ultra, the CIA-backed program, actually produced and funded Dirty Harry. And what this was about was a San Francisco cop hunting down a killer who uses ciphers called Scorpio. And the idea was that Zodiac would get pissed off about getting killed and caught by a cop, that he would reveal himself in some way. But Zodiac was far smarter than that. And also, as I'll reveal later, the real Zodiac was in a position to know that this was the plan. So while his ego may have led him to be caught by this, he was privy to the plan and he was able to avoid the snare. The lead investigators and a certain aspiring crime journalist, who we'll be talking about quite a bit in this video, eventually became convinced that there was one suspect who stood out above the rest, and his name was Arthur Lee Allen. By the early 90s, however, Arthur Lee Allen was dead and he had already been cleared by forensic evidence. Yet, both the San Francisco PD and this so-called investigator continued to promote their lie to this very day. So let's talk about why that is the case. The Arthur Lee Allen hypothesis is the canon explanation of who the Zodiac was. And like the cannons that Napoleon used on the British, these cannons were loaded with grape shot, and they were aimed at people who valued liberty and truth, and they were there to mow down what is good and just in the world. However, I'm going to give some credit, first of all, to non-canon theories that have come out on the internet by good, hardworking American investigators who have put aside mainstream propaganda and have tried to do their best to solve this case, even though they have failed fairly horribly. I'll just focus on a few victims or not a few victims, but a few suspects who are actually fairly plausible, and I can see why people got led astray into thinking that they might be real contenders. Ross Sullivan is someone who had brain damage, and he also was working as a janitor. So he was someone who had previously been in the military, suffered some brain damage, and now he was kind of a loser. He didn't really have any prospects, couldn't get laid, whatever, had no money. So he'd be bitter, and that would explain all the killings of couples. So I can see the connection, kind of makes sense. There's also Richard Gaikowski. He had a very distinctive, deep voice that was pretty creepy, and he was also interested in some pretty creepy shit, like different types of literature where they talk about killing people and whatnot. And the best of the non-canon theories revolves around a gentleman named Earl Van Best Jr. As you see from his picture here, he looks exactly like the sketch composite of the Zodiac. He had violent tendencies, a criminal record, and he was presented to the police as a suspect by his own son, which I think is a damning sign that his son would have this gut feeling that this guy is guilty. And, you know, to be fair, I bet Earl Van Best Jr. did kill a few people, but just looking at him here, he kind of has a hitman vibe, not a serial killer vibe. Because this guy could kind of blend in anywhere. If you look at those eyes, he's kind of dead-eyed and evil looking. So I could imagine him going into, say, a conference or something like that, blending in with all the other suits and then murdering someone in a hotel room, but certainly not drawing attention to himself by writing letters and being a Zodiac killer. Anyway, now let's get back to the main event and reveal who the true Zodiac killer is. The biggest obstacle to the Zodiac case at this point, but also the thing that got most people interested in it, including myself, was the 2007 Zodiac movie. And what this is more or less just a propaganda piece which presents the San Francisco PD version of events and also works with the so-called research of that aspiring crime investigator that I talked about earlier. This movie is fancy, well put together, and has an all-star cast. However, the real problem with this movie, above all the rest, is that it only offers one possible suspect for you to choose from, and that suspect is the already cleared Arthur Lee Allen. So all we see is one side of the story, and there's literally no evidence produced. They don't talk about all the evidence that works against Allen being the killer. Anyway, in that sense, as a piece of investigation and as a piece of journalism, the movie is absolutely horrible. Earlier I mentioned that there was an aspiring crime writer who drove the Arthur Lee Allen narrative, and I'd like to introduce that gentleman to you today. And this gentleman is also the Zodiac Killer. Meet Robert Graysmith. Born in 1942, Graysmith was 26 years old in 1968 when the killing started. Police believe that the real Zodiac Killer would have been anywhere from about 25 to 35 years old at the time of the killings, and Graysmith falls right in the middle of that, and the younger the better when it comes to being a serial killer. He was a cartoonist who started working at the San Francisco Chronicle in 1969, the exact same time that the Zodiac letters began to arrive. Coincidence? Not a chance. He left his job and lost his family while investigating the Zodiac. He was out at all hours of the night, and his wife eventually left him for being obsessive and weird. Well, the thing is, you know who else is out late at night prowling the streets? The Zodiac Killer. Graysmith is a true crime writer with 5 books under his belt, 2 of which are about the Zodiac and 1 of which is about Bob Crane, and as I'll prove in this video, all 3 of these books are written from first-hand experience since Robert Graysmith committed the murders involved. What is it that they say? The best preparation to write is to do. If you look at the FBI psychological profile of the Zodiac and then you compare it with the personality of Robert Graysmith, what you'll notice immediately is that there's a one-to-one correspondence across the board. Graysmith is obsessive, and he shows signs of paranoid delusions. We'll talk about some of those later. Graysmith, as a cartoonist, was very skilled in the visual arts, which could account for the somewhat contradictory physical appearances that he was able to present to the people who saw him at the crime scenes, and also why he was able to craft such a generic appearance for the Zodiac Killer, his killing persona. He chose a face that would be unremarkable and that would be remembered for the wrong reasons. So he was deliberately misleading people with the appearance that he chose to wear while he was committing his crimes, especially in the Paul Stine case where he knew that some people would see his face. Graysmith is completely and totally devoid of emotion, and he is more calculating than a reptile. As an obsessive who is interested in representation, Graysmith is also a master of ciphers, codes, and riddles. After all those are is just a way to take a simple message and put a bunch of encryption around it to make it hard to get at. So Graysmith is someone who is a natural at that kind of thing. And the other thing about Graysmith is the dude has a high IQ. One of the disqualifying marks for many supposed Zodiac suspects is that they are semi-illiterate pedophiles like Arthur Lee Allen, and there's no way that they were bright enough to come up with codes that can't be cracked. So Robert Graysmith fits every possible criteria to be the Zodiac Killer, and he checks every possible box. So let's talk about how Robert Graysmith was able to use his skills as a cartoonist to alter his appearance for the killings. Now, as you know, the descriptions of the Zodiac are that he was kind of a bulky, broad-shouldered guy, whereas Graysmith was slim, especially during his youth. So what he did was he wore bulky costumes, and this limited his mobility to some extent. So what he would do is he would wear shoulder pads and other things, and that made him appear to be bigger than he was. Also, the big vest over his clothes made him appear to be larger because it's a thick material. Graysmith used knives and guns to make up for his relatively modest hand-to-hand combat skills. He was never really a physical specimen. And if you have a weapon against an unarmed person, well, you don't really need to be. And he was young, so it didn't really matter too much. I mean, when you're young, you're relatively strong anyway. And the reason why he left so many victims alive by accident, there are two reasons. One is that he was a little physically impeded by these costumes. He's not super strong, as I said. And he's way more interested in the drama and publicity of these killings than the killing itself. He's not a compulsive killer. That's why the Zodiac was able to stop. He just wanted to make a career for himself by doing these killings and then writing about them and becoming famous as a crime investigator. The other thing that really helped him to figure out all of the cosmetology involved in being the Zodiac is that Graysmith is a bisexual, so he has some tendencies which make him better able to figure out fashion and figure out style and that kind of stuff like that. The actual murders and the subsequent taunting of police were only phase one in a two-phase project that defines the Zodiac Killer. Graysmith's early career, once he went full-time into true crime writing, was to figure out how to make a killing off of his most famous killings. And since about 1969, Graysmith has been pushing a narrative about Arthur Lee Allen, and he continued pushing that narrative even after Allen was cleared by DNA evidence in the early 90s. Graysmith actually had the unmitigated audacity to release an updated Zodiac book and the Zodiac film in 2007, which doubled down on his proven lies and deceptions, while winning over more believers than ever because the movie got an unprecedented amount of attention to these killings, and for most people this was all they ever saw, and maybe they went out and got his book. So then that's the only perspective they've ever been exposed to. So now it's just kind of a common knowledge thing that Arthur Lee Allen is the Zodiac Killer, even though that's not a true fact. It's fake news. The ultimate thrill for this killer, Robert Graysmith, is that he's able to splash his name on the cover of a book that talks about his own killings while not being blamed for it. So it's the best possible cover. The BTK killer was a church leader who was married. Robert Graysmith has a massively superior cover. He is the authority on these killings, so his ego gets stroked every time these killings come up because his name inevitably comes up at least once. Yet, it's never as a suspect. It's the perfect crime. And this is why, if Graysmith isn't a genius level IQ, then I don't know who would be. I mean, the only people smarter than this asshole have won Nobel Prizes. And it's really too bad that Graysmith didn't turn his genius level IQ to something productive rather than becoming a serial killer. But anyway, let's not digress on wasted talent. In the Zodiac movie, Graysmith is portrayed by actor Jake Gyllenhaal. Jake Gyllenhaal, of course, is a very handsome younger guy who looks a lot better than Graysmith ever looked even in his prime. So for Graysmith, this is a massive ego trip, and you can see the smug expression on his face in this picture with Jake Gyllenhaal. Now, Graysmith really goes to great lengths to paint a picture for the audience, which would reinforce the idea that he, as an investigator, was really frightened of these horrible suspects, while also showing him in proximity to all of them and making you wonder who was hunting who. It's very clever. Let me explain. So there are two scenes, one of which he meets Arthur Lee Allen and one of which he meets Richard Marshall, who takes a fake name in the movie. And basically in the Allen scene, he meets with Allen working at a hardware store, and he's supposedly so creeped out by Allen that he just freezes like a bitch and then runs out of the store. This is supposed to make you think that Robert Graysmith is this innocent, shy, kind dude, which is completely false. If he was scared at all, it would be because he would be afraid that Arthur Lee Allen would recognize him as the man who was trying to smear him. And Allen was much bigger, and Graysmith was not all that brave when he doesn't have his cloak and dagger in the literal sense. As for Richard Marshall, he was just a lonely middle-aged man who liked old movies and porn. And supposedly he had a creepy basement. But all basements are kind of creepy. And there's a scene where Robert Graysmith, the real Zodiac Killer, is in this basement alone with Richard Marshall, and supposedly he has to leave in a hurry because he's creeped out by Marshall and thinks Marshall might murder him, when in reality he was probably just resisting his own murderous impulses, and he didn't want to murder someone he said he was visiting, and thus put himself on the suspect block. The other big hint that we get in the movies, and where Graysmith is really stroking his dick pretty hard, is where we have the whole movie driving a narrative that Arthur Lee Allen is the killer. But then in the scenes of the killer, it's not the same actor who portrays Allen. Rather, it is just some generic actor. Why is that? Well, what it's showing you is that A, the narrative the movie is driving is complete and total horseshit, and 2, it is hinting that Graysmith is not above suspicion. Of course, Graysmith is never really, they don't really cast too much doubt on him, but just by leaving the killer generic, that means that Graysmith is still in the running, as were all of the males of that age range in the area. So it's a very subtle and very weak hint, but yet it's still there. And if you take it in coordination with the other hints, then I think it's pretty decisive. Clearly, Robert Graysmith is giving you all the clues that you need to solve this case. And I'll talk about another time where he did the same exact egomaniacal bullshit. There's another murder he committed where he made a movie out of it. Let's go look at that, and that will corroborate what I'm saying here. Robert Graysmith has a well-established modus operandi that he played to perfection in the Zodiac case. However, the Zodiac case was really his first killing spree, and this was what he intended to make his life's work about. So he needed sort of a trial run, but he had to do this trial run after his magnum opus, which is the opposite of how most artists would do their work. And again, we're talking about someone with a deranged mind who is a serial killer, so that's not too surprising that he kind of cocked up the order a little bit. Anyway, Bob Crane was murdered. Robert Graysmith was almost certainly responsible, and he wrote a book about it for no reason. This was not a super popular case, but then for whatever reason, Robert Graysmith decided to write about this, by far the most obscure thing he wrote about. And his book, The Murder of Bob Crane, was then made into a 2002 movie called Autofocus. And significantly, this was the only other Graysmith book to become a movie, because this is the only other killing that Graysmith was responsible for and then wrote a true crime book about. It's a very obvious pattern. This is his MO. This film, just like the Zodiac film, is a work of fiction which drives a narrative against another suspect, this time someone named John Henry Carpenter, whom the police cannot pin for the murder. So once again, this is Graysmith blaming some random dude for a crime that he did not commit, but that Robert Graysmith in fact committed. If we look at Graysmith's other works, he wrote two that stand out. One is on Jack the Ripper. Obviously, every serial killer is obsessed with Jack the Ripper. He committed crimes that shocked the world, and he got away with it. So that's something that appeals to serial killers, especially someone like the Zodiac, who, like to use knives for one, and also like to taunt police with his success. We also look at his other book, Unabomber, A Desire to Kill. What Graysmith is doing here is trying to really throw a bone to the online community. So there is a theory online, an obviously incorrect theory, that Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, is also the Zodiac Killer. Obviously, first of all, Kaczynski would have already confessed to being the Zodiac if he were in fact the Zodiac. Not only that, but because of that link that exists in some people's mind, the real Zodiac, Robert Graysmith, finds the Unabomber fascinating. He wonders what people see in his work that reminds them of the Unabomber. And I think in Ted Kaczynski, who's this former Berkeley professor, what Robert really sees there is an intellectual equivalent, someone who is and also a fellow accomplished serial killer. So he admires Kaczynski, and Kaczynski admires him, at least his work as the Zodiac, not as Robert Graysmith. So yeah, and the subtitle of the book is also a hint that Graysmith himself has a desire to kill. Again, look at the cover of the book. It will say Unabomber, A Desire to Kill, and then Robert Graysmith's name will be splashed on the page, right out in the open, just like with the Zodiac movie. So, again, the dude has an MO, and he has played it out at least once before, and if he writes any more true crime books about things that happened in his lifetime, I think it's pretty safe to say that he will have almost certainly had a significant role in committing those crimes. One commonly asked question about the Zodiac is what happened to him and where's he at today? Well, his name is Robert Graysmith. He's no longer murdering people because he's 76 years old, and I believe he murdered people in the first place because he wanted to make a bundle, and the dude is worth at least $5 million. So he's doing well for himself, he's living out his golden years, and his victims are all dead. Not only that, but the people he smeared have had their lives ruined. The media hounded Arthur Lee Allen. He eventually died of a massive heart attack due to the pressure put on him by the fiction of the Zodiac Killer, the real one. And he's written books in his retirement from serial killing about people like Ted Kaczynski and Jack the Ripper, who are his heroes. He's also written about some historical stuff in San Francisco. He admires the city because it's his hometown, and it's where he made himself famous, both as Robert Graysmith and as the Zodiac Killer. So the Zodiac has lived the American dream, and I only wish I could say the same thing about his victims. Hopefully the police will eventually wise up and figure out that Robert Graysmith is in fact the Zodiac Killer and is the worst person in the United States living today outside of Democratic Party leadership. Anyway, that's all I've got for you. I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias, and I'm signing out after a hard day's work and a hard day of excellent work.